Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. I'm Norman Sadeh, professor of computer science at Carnegie Mellon University. I don't know about you, but I've always been fascinated by maps, especially the ones with lots of colors. And if this clicker works, we might be able to look at one. So I'm sure you'll recognize this one. It's a map of Connecticut, and obviously it's got lots of colors and it contains a lot of information. It's a map that has been generated based on data collected as part of the 2010 census. And so these maps are very helpful. They help us make a number of decisions. They determine how many people we're going to be sending to Congress for between different states. They tell us a number of different things also when it comes to how we might want to allocate money when it comes to a variety of different projects. And if you've never been to the census website, I strongly recommend it. It's a highly engaging website. There are lots of different maps you can generate. So if, like me, you like all these colored maps, you can actually generate quite a few. What some of you may not know is that in order for us to be able to generate these maps, we have to engage in these very extensive efforts. The 2010 census cost about $13 billion. It actually involved hiring over 600,000 people. Many of these people were in charge of tracking down people who had failed to return their forms. And so obviously it's a very onerous process, and obviously one that's very, very helpful. What these maps also miss, and what you are not going to find on the website operated by the census, is information about the way we perceive the environment around us. This is something that Kevin Lynch introduced in the 60s, something that we refer to as mental maps. A mental map is the way we perceive the environment around us, the types of places that we know about, the places that we're going to likely go to buy groceries, to meet with our friends, to watch movies, and what have you, and how we might potentially want to go from one place to another. These maps are very personal. Someone who lives in a very different place in the city, who's got very different interests, might have a map that's of very little interest to me. On the other hand, someone who lives nearby and has very similar interests might actually have in his mental map some information that would be very meaningful to me. I might actually discover places I would love to find out more about. I might actually go and explore these places and see for myself whether I like them. And so collectively, these maps, as aggregated from all the different people in a city, really provide us with some sort of collective wisdom, the understanding that people have developed over the years about where to go for different things. They also provide us with some insight into the social fabric of the city, because effectively these mental maps tell us where different people are likely to be found as they engage in different activities, where you go shopping, where you go and eat at restaurants, where you go watch movies, etc. And so you might say, this is very interesting, and obviously perhaps information that we'd like to have beyond what the census is collecting. And so perhaps we should actually collect many more of these maps. And so how are these maps traditionally collected? Well, the urban planners who've traditionally been collecting these maps have typically engaged in hundreds, if not thousands of hours of observation, just looking at people, looking at their activities, looking at what they do during the course of the day to understand really what it would tell you about their mental maps, the kinds of places that are meaningful to them. And so that entails, like I said, many hours of observation, hours where you go and interview people to try to clarify things. Not a very light process, a very tedious process, in fact. And it's no surprise that today we have very few of these maps, right? They're very onerous to collect. And so it's no surprise also that we don't also have maps like these to inform us about the impact of new projects that we might want to launch in a city. For instance, what if I were to open a new mall in this area? What if I were to open a movie theater? How is this likely to impact the mental maps that people in the city have and eventually their behavior? Well, we don't have these mental maps, so we can't tell. But the world is changing, right? Social networks are around now. And so Facebook today has 1 billion users. You've got sites like Foursquare. Foursquare has about 25 million users today. These users, what do? Well, effectively what they do is they share their location. So they go to different places and they basically announce to the world, at least most of the time, that, hey, here I am. And this is called a check-in, right? And so these check-ins are made visible to essentially the public at large, at least most of the time. Occasionally you can restrict those to some friends. And these check-ins really are motivated by a number of different goals. Some people are just trying to impress their friends, saying, hey, look, I'm hanging out at this really cool concert. Others are intended to obtain discounts on coffee, and others might just be intended to be open invitation to your friends, saying, hey, I'm having a coffee at Starbucks. If you're nearby, why don't you stop by and join me? We might have an interesting conversation. But whatever the motivation behind these check-ins, they offer a glimpse into the mental maps of all these different people. They offer some insight into what are the places that are meaningful to different individuals in the city. And so the question is, could somehow this information be harnessed to help us finally build these mental maps that have been so elusive in the past? And so the Lifehoods project, which we started 2 years ago at Carnegie Mellon University, was intended to explore this question. And we started by crawling the web, and in particular looking at public tweets, and public tweets that were annotated with Foursquare check-ins. So many people, when they tweet these days, they will include some indication as to where they are at the time they're tweeting. And effectively, that's also a check-in. And so we limit ourselves to public check-ins. We don't want to invade anyone's privacy. We actually sanitize all of this data to make sure that we didn't have any private residencies or anything like that. And we picked a small sample of check-ins, about 18 million check-ins. Right? So today, Foursquare users have actually produced over 2.5 billion check-ins. So this is actually a fairly small number of check-ins on the whole. And we looked at these check-ins, which are basically a bunch of different venues, and we asked ourselves, what does this really tell us? And so when you look at each one of these venues, each one of them is characterized by a different mix of people. Right? A restaurant will see a certain mix of people. A movie theater will see a slightly different mix of people. And some of these venues are obviously going to be more closely related than others. For instance, venues that have a very similar type of mix of people coming to them might tell us something about the fact that they're closely related. If you see someone in one of these places, you might potentially see that same person in the other place. And so you can start looking at relationships between venues and see to what extent that helps you build these types of mental maps that I was talking about. In particular, you can come up with metrics that will measure the social distance between different venues. Effectively, you can say, if I'm going to look at how close the mix of people at one venue is from the mix of people I'm going to find at another venue. And when I do that, I can build a graph. In this case, you see a graph here where the edges connecting some nodes are very fat in some cases, indicating that these locations are very close in terms of mix of people, while other venues are not very closely connected. They're very weakly connected. They've got very thin lines connecting them, or perhaps they're not connected at all. The people you find in one venue never go to another. And so you can take this sort of data, which we did, and then you can apply to it a variety of different algorithms that I'm going to collectively refer to as clustering algorithms, and I'm going to spare you the details here. But when you do that, what you see is you start seeing some neighborhoods that are going to emerge organically just from those check-ins that have essentially been initiated by a variety of different people. Through their check-ins, they've told us the types of places they go to, and now we're seeing some neighborhoods emerge organically from this type of analysis. We refer to these neighborhoods as Lifehoods. Right? And you might say, well, what do these Lifehoods look like? Well, when you conduct this type of analysis on a broad scale with 18 million check-ins, like I said, you can generate a bunch of different maps, like this map of Manhattan, for instance. And when you look at these maps, which we've spent quite a bit of time doing, as you can imagine, you find, fortunately enough, that there are some very typical areas that you're going to recognize, like in this case, Broadway, and you're going to find places like Soho and the financial district. But there's a lot more to it than that also. For instance, Foursquare also provides you with information about the types of businesses and the types of venues you find in a given place. And so now we can look at categories of venues found in a Lifehood, and that tells us a lot about the types of activities that people will likely engage in these different neighborhoods. These check-ins also come with time information. So we can now look at also the hourly pulse of different neighborhoods. We can look at the daily pulse of these different neighborhoods. We can look at the flow of people between these different neighborhoods during the course of the day. And so this is the kind of information that we're interested in capturing. This is the kind of information that you would find in mental maps but that you would not typically find in information like what the census would be collecting traditionally. And if this clicker is willing, which it doesn't seem to be, I might be able to show you more things. So here is something else that you can do. Because these livelihoods are characterized by the mix of people that comes to the different venues contained in them, you can also ask the following question. You can say, well, where else do these people go? What are the livelihoods that are most closely connected to a given livelihood? And so these are the kinds of things that you can see if you're looking, for instance, at this particular livelihood here. You find that the other 5 most closely connected livelihoods are the ones that are being displayed here in the following, in these different colors. And so all this looks very good and sounds very encouraging, obviously. But it's not the case that these livelihoods always match the traditional municipal boundaries. In fact, if they did, we would not really have accomplished very much. And so what was interesting to us was to actually look at those areas where the livelihoods we had come up with would actually differ from what you would find on more traditional maps. And so we actually built a collection. We assembled a collection of areas where there were discrepancies between what our analysis was producing and what traditional maps were telling us. And obviously, we're curious to see to what extent these discrepancies had to do with potentially noise, or potentially a major flaw in our algorithm, or potentially something else. Right? And so the kinds of things that you're seeing when you do that is you're seeing essentially maps like this one. So this is your typical municipal boundary in an area in the southern part of Pittsburgh. This area is also known as the South Side Flats. And according to traditional maps, it's a single area. But our algorithm actually finds 4 different livelihoods in it: LH7, 8, 9, and also 6. And so one of the things we did is we went to talk to locals, people who are actually living in these different neighborhoods. And we did this in a very systematic manner to try and understand what was going on. Were these just flukes, or were we actually seeing something that was not typically being reported? And so some of these things were pretty obvious. So for instance, this South Side Flats area, as it turns out, is an area that's primarily organized around a major artery here. You see all these dots. This is known as Carson Street. It's a popular nightlife destination also for many students, as it turns out. But there's a lot more going on there. And in fact, one of the recent changes in this area is this new development that started a few years ago. This is a development that has produced essentially a mixed use, as it's called, area with modern office buildings, luxury condos, an open-air mall with well-known national brands, an area that most people would clearly view as being distinct, but that is not yet captured by existing maps. But if this was all we were capturing, this would not be very much. And so it was interesting through interviews of a number of people to see how much more we're actually able to capture. So for instance, when we looked at whether or not people saw a difference between livelihood 7 here and livelihood 8, we were getting all sorts of different comments telling us that there was more going on here than you would typically be able to capture in a more traditional fashion. So for instance, here is a quote that we got from someone comparing LH7 and LH8. Whenever I was living down on 15th Street, and obviously there are grammatical errors here, these are real quotes, right? Whenever I was living down on 15th Street in LH7, I had to worry about drunk people following me home. This is an area with lots of bars. This is where you see all these dots. But on 23rd Street, when I would, on 23rd Street, I need to worry about people trying to mug you. So it's different. It's not something I had anticipated, but there is a distinct difference between these two areas. So issues of safety somehow seem to be captured, and those are examples of things that you would certainly associate with mental map types of models. Here is another quote. So someone had noticed that these two different areas here, LH7 and LH8, also differed in terms of architecture. LH7 is an area where bars are very close to one another. When you move into LH7, the feel is actually very different. There are fewer businesses, which explains why this person was a bit more concerned also about being mugged. So here's another quote, which is very typical of the kinds of things that we've come across. From an urban standpoint, it's a lot tighter on the western part. Once you get west of 17th Street or 18th Street, which is LH7 again. But the most interesting thing here is actually this other livelihood, LH6, that I'm going to tell you a bit more about. So LH6 was one of those areas that I was not even aware of, even though I've been living in Pittsburgh for close to 25 years. It's one of those areas that's really organized around a supermarket. This supermarket goes by the name of Giant Eagle. That's a fairly famous supermarket chain in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and I think also Maryland. This supermarket, as it turns out, has its very own unique demographic attached to it. And so when you go and interview people, they will actually confirm that the people they see there are actually very different from people you're likely to meet in the other Lifehoods that make up this particular area. So here's a typical quote. There is this interesting mix of people there, referring to this Livehood 6. I don't see walking around the neighborhood. I think they are coming to the Giant Eagle from lower-income neighborhoods. I always assumed that they came from up the hill. And so that was an interesting reference to another area of the city where you have lower-income people living. And we actually went ahead and looked at what our Livehood information told us. So we said, well, what are the Lifehoods that are most closely related to Livehood number 6? And surely enough, we found that the Livehood that was most closely connected to it was not one of the Lifehoods that was just adjacent to it. It was not LH7, 8, or 9. It was this Livehood here, which is indeed up the hill, which indeed corresponds to where you find people with lower incomes. These people do not have a supermarket in their area, and they're forced, therefore, to go down the hill to go shopping for groceries. And so those are the kinds of things that now we're able to capture with this type of analysis. This is an example of a community that's not properly served today in terms of supermarkets, and those are the kinds of things that you see coming out of this type of analysis. So this is obviously not the only neighborhood that we looked at. We looked at a number of other neighborhoods and uncovered a number of interesting patterns. In some situations, we found that traditional neighborhoods were starting to spill into one another, like in this case here, where you have two very distinct neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. One is known as Shadyside. It's viewed as a more affluent neighborhood. Another one that traditionally has been associated with lower income population, which is known as East Liberty. About 10 years ago, and these neighborhoods are very distinct. In fact, they're separated by a train track. There's also a public busway separating them. It couldn't be more obvious. But about 10 years ago, Whole Foods came in there and opened a store, and then a number of additional restaurants opened up. And before you knew it, in fact, these developments essentially resulted in changes in people's behaviors. And all of a sudden, we saw actually that these two populations were actually starting to interact in areas where traditionally they had not been interacting, or at least the territory, if you want, was actually shifting in some meaningful way. We saw some maps where some neighborhoods were essentially being split into a number of finer neighborhoods, just like the example I showed you earlier, as well as areas where two different areas that traditionally had been viewed as being separate were actually being merged. And so all this was very gratifying. It was confirmed through a number of interviews. And we obviously got a lot of good feedback through these interviews from a variety of different stakeholders expressing interest in having access to this information. Now, this being said, obviously this type of analysis has its limitations. As I said, there are only 25 million Foursquare users out there, and so we're clearly looking at a skewed sample. Not everyone is ready to start checking in at random places. You don't find too many people checking in from AA meetings and abortion clinics and jail and those kinds of things. So we're clearly missing some of those things as well. But by and large, we feel that this has more to do with the data that we use rather than with the methodology. And in fact, as this is supposed to represent here, we got a lot of interest over the past few months, got a lot more interest from the press as well as from a number of different stakeholders in the research that we had done, showing that there were many different people who found that this kind of data could potentially be very useful to them, and many organizations also offering us a lot more data than we could potentially handle, at least immediately. So social networks are obviously controversial. This is where we get our data from. They're controversial from a privacy standpoint, but at the same time, they're a reality, right? The billion people on Facebook today are not going to evaporate anytime soon, as far as I know. And so it's very gratifying to see that with all the data generated through these social networks, we can, in fact, turn this data into something that might potentially open new possibilities, provide us with essentially an entirely different way of looking at our cities and gathering data about locations from a distance. The kinds of things that I've shown you are not things that were unknown to people at large. They were certainly known to the locals. But now I'm able to essentially conduct this kind of analysis and come up with similar conclusions while doing this from the comfort of my office at Carnegie Mellon, and doing so for a lot less money than what you might have spent if you were to look at this in comparison to, for instance, what the census does. It's a lot less accurate too. So we see lots of possibilities, certainly in terms of urban planning, predicting also how these livelihoods change over time in response to new developments. Public health is an obvious way an obvious area to look at also in terms of how people interact, how disease might spread, think about the flu, etc. And we're clearly just starting to scratch the surface. So I'd like to thank you for your time. And this is the end of my talk.